Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and start. My name is Nathan Davy. I'm on staff here at Park Cities Presbyterian Church. For those of you who may not know me. And today I am going to talk about several hymns, each of which have something to do with pain and suffering. Everyone should have a handout, first of all. If you don't, raise your hand and we will get you one. As Brett passes those out, let me walk you through the format for this morning. So we'll go twice through your handout, essentially. Once as I talk about each of the hymns included, and for some of them play through a verse. For those hymns that may be less familiar to you. And then, at the very end, after that's happened, we'll all sing all of them all the way through, with one exception, and that's toward the end, there is a hymn, My Song is Love Unknown, and for that one, my friend Will Hughes will sing through the first 4, 5 verses, and then you'll join in on the sixth one, which is the one for which you have music. So, but for everything else, we'll sing through all. But that won't happen at the end. It should be pretty obvious. Some of these, all of these, except for Love Unknown, is in the hymnal that we use regularly at PCPC. And some of them will be very familiar to you. For example, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Some of them may be less familiar, but you've heard them before. Abide With Me, for example. Some may be really not familiar at all. Jesus, Priceless Treasure, I assume, will be that way for most of you. God Moves in a Mysterious Way, which I'll start with, is one that I've known about the text of for a long time. It just wasn't ever on heavy rotation, so to speak, on the Sunday morning worship lineup in any of the churches that I've been in, which is really too bad, because as we'll see, it's incredible poetry, and it's poetry that comes from a really difficult life. William Cowper, so it looks like Cowper, but it's pronounced Cooper. His mother died when he was 6, and his father sent him off to boarding school. By Cooper's account, his father was a cold and distant kind of man. And so Cooper grew up feeling that estrangement and also feeling very insecure in himself, shy, retiring. He dealt with periods of severe loneliness and depression for his entire life. The first attack of this nature, which came when he was 21, he described it in these words: I was struck with such a dejection of spirits as none but they who have felt the same can have the least conception of. Day and night I was upon the rack, lying down in horror and rising up in despair. He was helped out of this first period of depression in his life by the poetry of George Herbert, who Elizabethan and after that poet, whose poetry I really, really recommend if you're not familiar with it. And several years later, when he was in his mid to late 20s, his father welcomes all those you coming in. Make sure you grab a handout. And we're talking about the first hymn in your handout, God Moves in a Mysterious Way. When he was in his mid-20s, his father, who wanted him to have a political and legal career, got a position lined up for him that would be a clerk of Parliament, or something like that. Clerk of Journals in Parliament. But Parliament said, all right, before you can come do this, you need to stand up in front of everyone and we'll grill you. And Cooper was not, he was filled with dread about that, and he actually attempted suicide 3 separate ways in the days leading up, and each time he was preserved. He tried to throw himself into the Thames, but the water he went to throw himself into the Thames, but realized the water was too shallow. And there was a guy standing there who kept him from actually being able to make himself do it. He tried to hang himself, but the garter that he used broke. Finally, he tried to take laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, but found his hands so spasmed that he couldn't actually pick it up to do it. After that, he was committed to an insane asylum for a number of years. But there, an evangelical doctor shared the gospel with him, left a Bible very conveniently placed for him to find and read, and he was saved by reading, among other things, John 11, the raising of Lazarus, and a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans. He struggled after that, though, both with just depression in general, but also despair about sin. After the first time he attempted suicide, he wrote, "Conviction of sin took place, especially of that just committed. The meanness of it, as well as its atrocity, were exhibited to me in colors so inconceivably strong that I despised myself, with a contempt not to be imagined or expressed. I had failed in my design, yet I had all the guilt of that crime to answer for, a sense of God's wrath, and a deep despair of escaping it instantly succeeded. The fear of death became more prevalent in me than ever the desire of it had been." Several years after his release from the asylum, he came to know, of all people, John Newton, who almost all of us know as the author of Amazing Grace and the slave trader turned pastor. And John became one of his closest friends, a very sympathetic and giving person. He recognized in Cooper a poetic ability and encouraged him in that. Cooper had always excelled in languages, and at Newton's encouragement, the two of them collaborated on a hymnal for Newton's little parish, Olney, and they called that the Olney Hymnal. And so John Newton wrote 200 hymns for that, and William Cooper wrote 65. Cooper's hymns that he wrote for that include, as are in your handout, There is a Fountain Filled with Blood, which many of us sing, and Oh, for a Closer Walk with God, which I always hear in a kind of like country western sound, but it was, in fact, an 18th century English hymn written by this man who suffered so terribly. Though in the company of friends and fellow believers for the rest of his life, Cooper continued to have severe depressive periods, about every 10 years or so. During these times, he'd be overwhelmed with despair and attempt to take his own life. He never succeeded. And it is uncertain whether he overcame these doubts at the end of his life, which was in 1800. He did write, referring to his life, loaded, as he said, with despair and being uncertain as to why God did not relieve him of this thorn in the flesh. He writes, "God's ways are mysterious, and he giveth no account of his matters. There is a mystery in my destruction, and in time it shall be explained." But he realized that even though suffering all this like horrible despair, he knew that he couldn't relieve himself of it. He knew that God could, and he knew that sometime he'd know why, even if it was after his death. I don't have time to read it all, but this kind of dread and despair, even in a non-sinful sense of the word, is in the scriptures in Psalm 88. I'll read the last line. "You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness," is the last line of that psalm. But despite that, Cooper writes this hymn, which I'd encourage you now to turn and look at. "God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea, and rides upon the storm. In biblical poetic imagery, a storm is always God's wrath and judgment. And so to Cooper, this sense of God's judgment on himself and why he can't rid himself over that is the mystery. And so he uses 5 metaphors in the next verses. Deep and unfathomable minds of never-failing skill. So he refers to the reasons behind God's goodness as something that's buried, even though it's beautiful, out of sight for him that he can't see. Verse 3, ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy, and shall break in blessings on your head. So these clouds, you don't know why. But the actual judgment of God and the things you are suffering are, in fact, God's purpose and his mercy. The next 2 lines are poetically more easy to understand. Verse 6, blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. That phrase, to scan his work, to scan a poem is to look at the way the syllables are arranged and the long and short syllables. It's a very technical term. And to try to find the meter that the poem is in. So you're looking at this thing of beauty and trying to find, okay, how is this put together? How does this work? Is this the long? And so Cooper says that if you blind unbelief is not able to do that with the work of God. But God is his own interpreter. And this poem, this work, God's will that he's presenting to us, he will make the poem plain. What we can do is we can see in the words of this hymn, we can see the beauty of God's purpose. We can see the fact of God's will, but we can't always understand it. The tune of this hymn is probably more familiar to you than others. So I'll play through it in its entirety when we come back and sing together. For now, let's turn to Abide With Me. Henry Francis Light wrote the text, and William Monk wrote the tune. Henry Light was an interesting person. He was kind of the 19th century Renaissance man doing languages and taking private students. He was a pastor. He was an amateur archaeologist. He dug up this stuff. A lot of, as a very short aside, I can't take too much time, but as a weird fact of life, the amateur scientist of any type in 19th century England tended to be a member of the clergy. And all these parsons and vicars and curates were doing this crazy stuff with genetic work, with archaeology, publishing all this stuff. It's really quite interesting. So Henry Light was one of 2 children. His father deserted his family when he was young, and got him and his brother into a school, and then left. He showed academic promise, Henry Light did, from an early age, but his faith was nominal. However, when in attendance on a dying priest, that priest convicted him of the truth of the gospel that he had been preaching and learning about, but hadn't truly believed. He ministered to a large parish that consisted in large part of poor fishermen. Despite his learning and his esoteric, all these guys studied Latin and Greek and German and could read this, that, and the other, and he's ministering to a parish of fishermen and visiting them in their houses. He suffered from very poor health throughout his entire life, having asthma, bronchitis, pneumonia. Eventually, few years prior to his death, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. The common cure at that era was to go abroad for a couple months out of the year, and if you're in cold, rainy, damp England, then to go to the south of France for a couple months during the winter probably actually did help a lot. He preached his farewell sermon to his congregation on the subject of the Lord's Supper a few months before he died. Went up to his room and wrote the text to Abide with Me, and he died a few months later. The composer William Monk, who wrote the tune, composed this tune shortly after the death of his own 3-year-old daughter. It's not a tune that's as well known in the States. In England, this is a classic, to such an extent that they sing it before 2 rugby matches a year, or I think it's rugby. There are 2 particular, like culmination, like this is the exhibition rugby match of whatever town, and everyone in the whole stadium stands up and sings this hymn. It's like, I don't understand exactly why, but it has a very it's very dear to a lot of people in this tune. And I want to take a brief moment to point out some things about the tune especially. First, it begins and ends with the same phrase, the text, Abide with Me, and the same musical phrase. Is the opening, and then at the end, so it reinforces that all right, this is a way of making a final statement in music. And the music then is pointing to the reality that Christ is abiding with us. Listening, actually, Will, if you could come up, we'll sing through the first verse once, since this may be less familiar. And then I'll point out a couple things about it. Don't want to play bad harmony because I'm making it up myself. Firstly, I put some wrong notes in the music. And several points to anyone who can raise their hand and point it out. But I want you to listen. Will thought like, wait, oh no, this isn't what I know. Listen to the end. Help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Sing that and you'll be fine. The general shape of the notes for a couple of them is off, but just listen and you'll get it. But one thing, so you see the first phrase. It begins where it starts. The second phrase, however, becomes more insistent. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. And the music becomes more insistent too. Listen as it pushes up. This is where I'm going. And also look at the fifth verse. Hold thou the cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. That same phrase really marries that to that music as well. Point me to the skies.
literally points out. One more thing, too nice to leave. The third line, when other helpers fail and comforts flee, the music contracts in itself and goes into a minor key. Right there, I'll just play that phrase, when other helpers. So the music is doing the same thing as the text in that place. It's a really lovely marriage of text and tune.
All right, moving on to Jesus' Priceless Treasure. This hymn, I almost guarantee, at the very most, one other person besides me knows. Does anyone know this hymn or this text? Two. Okay, I was close. This is an incredible text and a very lovely tune. It's Johann Frank wrote the text. We don't know a whole lot about him. Apart that he was a politician. He was a mayor and member of parliament and collaborated with Kruger on a number of different hymns. Johann Kruger was the composer of the tune, and he published the most influential hymnal in 17th century Germany for Protestant Lutherans. They both lived during the 30 Years' War, a time of terrible upheaval and strife, compounded with famine and plague. Johann Kruger's, he and his whole family contracted the plague. He survived, and his wife and 5 children died. It was really, really a bad time. And so in the music of this tune, you can hear that suffering reflected. Not on your handout, but the harmonization that everyone uses now is by Bach. He did some pieces based on this tune and text, in particular the harmonization, but he wrote one of his most famous pieces is the Chaconne from the Partita in D minor for solo violin. Some of you may be familiar with it. Embedded in that piece are a number of references to particular hymns, and one of them that occurs throughout is this one, Jesu meine Freude. Bach wrote that piece shortly after he came home after a 2-week trip abroad. So he left, came back for 2 weeks, found that his wife had become ill, died, and was buried when he walked through the door of his house. There's just no way of news to travel. So this was a very precious tune to him. I want to call your attention to the text in a few different ways. For those of you who know German, you see, all right, Jesu meine Freude. Freude actually means joy in German. This is a pretty loosely poetic translation. And so the text begins and ends in the original as Jesus, my joy. The beginning of the first verse, the end of the last verse. And the fourth verse, I want to just read for you in a very literal translation, and you can follow along. Vanish spirits of gloom, for my joyful master Jesus enters in. For those who love God, even their grief must become pure delight. And he's writing this after his wife and 5 children died of the plague. Here I may have scorn and derision, but even in the midst of suffering, you remain, Jesus, my joy. The verse 3 is one of the most incredible verses to sing of anything everywhere. You can look. You can read along in this translation, but here's a literal translation of the original. I defy the ancient dragon. I defy the jaws of death. I defy the fear they cause. Rage, world, and leap upon me. I stand here and sing in the calm of certainty. God's power takes care of me. Earth and hell's abyss must fall silent, however much they roar. I'm going to invite Will to come up and sing this too.
Listen, I won't say a lot about this afterwards particularly, but the tune, as you listen to it, it's pretty downcast sounding. It's very heavy and minor, but the text is one of joy in that suffering. And so I think what the composer and the collaborative author, because they worked together to write this text and tune, I think what they're saying is that even though what we're feeling in this music is our reality, we can still say these words and affirm them.
Jesus priceless treasure, source of glorious pleasure, truest friend to me. Long my heart hath panted, till it well I fainted, thirsting after thee. Thine I am, O spotless Lamb, I will suffer not to hide thee, ask for not beside thee.
So my song is Love Unknown.
I don't, for one, we're even now starting to run short on time. For another, their particular stories of life is less pertinent to this music. What I do want to say, though, is that throughout any suffering that we have, we need to look to the suffering of Christ. As Matt mentioned this morning, Romans 5:3-5, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character hope, and hope does not put us to shame because of God's love through the Holy Spirit. I encourage you to go read 1 Peter 2 and James 1. Count it all joy, my brothers. He opens his letter like this. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Blessed is the man, later in the chapter, who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. Finally, 1 Peter, part of it, Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. So this hymn, My Song is Love Unknown, is not in our hymnal. It's less familiar. It is one of the most incredible hymns, both in music and in text, about the Passion of Christ. And so I wanted to introduce it to you and include it. For this one, when we come back and sing everything, will sing verses 1, 3, 4, and 5. I included verse 2, but the arrangement we're using doesn't. And then we'll invite you all to join us on the last verse, by which point hopefully you'll be somewhat familiar with the tune. It's not the hardest of tunes. It does have some tricky parts, some really moving and emotional parts. All right, finally, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. We think of Martin Luther as the boisterous, rowdy, aggressive bulldog of a man, right? Like going to the pub and drinking beer. Take that, Pope. I'm going to marry myself a nun. And he was all that. But throughout his whole life, he struggled with what he called his Anfechtung, which is a German word I discovered that he used. I didn't discover the word. He uses that word. I discovered his use of it, and that it doesn't really have a good English translation. It's almost like a struggle, a fighting out of something. And so he, right before he wrote, and we're about the time, as best as we can surmise, that he wrote A Mighty Fortress, because we don't know exactly. But about that same time, this is 1527, he underwent a very large amount of trying circumstances. His friend, the Protestant pastor Georg Winkler, had been murdered, assassinated at the behest of the Cardinal of Mainz, the Archbishop of Mainz, sorry. Another of his Protestant friends was arrested when he went through a Catholic country to visit his own dying father. He was arrested, burned at the stake. That same summer, plague struck. Luther's house was used as a hospital. He was very ill, I don't think with the plague, but his oldest son got sick. His friends, two of his friends died in his own house from the plague. His wife, Katie, was expecting their second child. One of his friends, who was also expecting, gave birth and then died. So he's very worried. And in the middle of that, he experiences one of these periods of Anfechtung. And he wrote in a letter to a pastor friend, I forget whether it was Melanchthon or not. It may have been someone else. He said, "For more than a whole week I have been tossed to and fro in death and in hell, so that I am still drained of all my strength in my body and am trembling in all my limbs. I have lost Christ completely and have been shaken by the floods and storms of despair and blasphemy." This is Luther writing this. "However, as moved by the prayers of the saints, God has begun to have mercy on me and to snatch my soul from deepest hell." And in the context of all that is when he writes, "A mighty fortress is our God." For Luther, things ended well as the year ended. He recovered, his wife recovered, the plague petered out. He gradually came out of this period of being downcast. His wife gave birth to their firstborn daughter. Everyone was healthy. But he writes again about his suffering. "My hope is that my own battle is of service to many, although there is no evil that my sins have not deserved. Yet my life consists in this, that I know and boast that I have taught the word of Christ purely." He was wondering, why are my friends being martyred? And why am I here suffering this doubt and despair? And so, but he realized, to him he said, this is an attack of the devil, and my own battle needs to be for the benefit of others, and it's on account of them that I'm suffering this, and not for my own. All right. So, if you turn back to the beginning now, we will just sing through everything. I invite you to stand. Let's see if I wrote this all down on the spot. I don't think I did. And when we get to "My Song is Love Unknown," you can have a seat for the first verses, and when it's time to stand and sing the last verse, you can stand up again. Obviously, if you get tired and have to sit down at any time, you're perfectly welcome to sit down. All right, God Moves in a Mysterious Way by William Cooper.
Amen.
disposal. If you need to go, please feel free to do so. Everyone knows A Mighty Fortress is Our God. We all just sang it on Sunday. So I think we've got that one. What I would love to do, though, is share with you one last hymn. My song is Love Unknown. So when we rise to sing that last verse, I think we'll just end there. I'm happy to stay afterwards.